Avoidant realizes their mistake when anxious does these three things. You know that person who always pulls away, keeps their distance, and seems completely unbothered, until suddenly you see them panic, reach out, or act in ways you never expected. That's when the avoidant realizes they've made a mistake, and how they respond next could change everything. Avoidants often retreat when emotions get intense. They tell themselves that distance is safety, but here's the truth. The moment anxiety hits, the avoidant realizes what they might have lost. And in that anxiety, something powerful happens. They start doing things that show they're human, vulnerable, and maybe even ready to change. Today, I'm going to break down exactly what they do when they realize their mistake, so you can understand the signs and navigate the situation wisely. There's a very particular moment when someone who has been distant, someone who has been so careful to protect themselves with walls, suddenly reaches out. It's not always consistent. It's not always predictable, and it often takes the person on the receiving end completely by surprise. But this act, simple as it may seem, carries enormous meaning. For the avoidant, reaching out is not an easy step. It's not something they do lightly or casually. They've spent so much of their life believing that distance is safety, that detachment protects them from pain, that they are safest when they keep their emotions tightly controlled. So when that carefully constructed barrier begins to crumble, when anxiety creeps in and the fear of loss becomes real, it creates a kind of internal tension that they can no longer ignore. When an avoidant suddenly reaches out, it's usually triggered by something very specific, the realization that they might have made a mistake, that they might have pushed someone away who actually mattered to them. It doesn't always happen immediately, and sometimes it takes a period of reflection or even a wave of panic for them to act, but when they do, the action itself is loaded with significance. A text message, a call, or a seemingly casual, "Hey, how are you?" can carry 1,000 unspoken emotions. Beneath that simple contact is the anxiety they've been trying to ignore, the fear that they've lost something valuable, and the subconscious acknowledgement that distance is no longer serving them in the way they thought it would. It's important to recognize that this reaching out is rarely about control or manipulation, though it can sometimes feel that way to the person on the receiving end. For the avoidant, the act itself is often clumsy, tentative, and sometimes awkward. They may not know exactly what to say, or they might overcompensate in their words and actions. That's because deep down, they're confronting something uncomfortable. The gap between the persona they've maintained, independent, self-sufficient, emotionally untouchable, and the reality of their feelings, which are very human, very vulnerable, and very much in need of connection. You might notice patterns in the way this reaching out manifests. Sometimes it's delayed. They may vanish for days, weeks, or even months, only to suddenly appear with a message that seems out of the blue. This isn't necessarily a lack of care. It's often their way of processing their own emotions before they can safely communicate them. They need to feel ready to ensure they won't be overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. The suddenness is actually a reflection of the inner turmoil they've been experiencing in silence. The act itself, though small, signals a breakthrough in their internal struggle. They've weighed the risks, acknowledged the vulnerability, and decided that connection is worth stepping into discomfort. When avoidants reach out, there's often a mix of hesitation and urgency. Their words might feel tentative, cautious, or apologetic. They might ask questions, or they might share something personal they've been holding back, even if the words are simple, like "I've been thinking about you," or "Can we talk?" There's a vulnerability embedded in them. These are not words they toss out lightly. For someone who is used to avoiding emotional intimacy, each word is a deliberate decision, an acknowledgement that they care enough to risk feeling exposed. This reaching out is also a test, a way of gauging the response, seeing if the bridge back to closeness is possible and determining whether it's safe for them to continue moving toward connection. The timing of the contact is also significant. It usually comes after a period of absence or withdrawal, often at a point when they feel the weight of their own actions. They may have noticed the silence, the distance, or the subtle cues that the other person is hurt, disappointed, or moving away. Anxiety is what triggers them to act. It's not just missing someone, it's the recognition that their avoidance has consequences, and that their usual strategies of detachment can no longer protect them from the discomfort of potentially losing someone important. That tension, that acute awareness of what's at stake, is what propels them forward. It's fascinating to watch from an outside perspective because it's such a departure from their usual patterns. An avoidant who has been consistently distant suddenly initiates contact in ways that might feel uncharacteristic, even surprising. They might send a message at an odd hour, call unexpectedly, or attempt to create a moment of connection that feels deliberate. These actions are driven by more than just anxiety. They are fueled by a desire to repair, to understand, and to reclaim a connection they've realized they value. The avoidance that once defined them is temporarily set aside because the fear of loss outweighs the comfort of distance. This reaching out also signals a moment of emotional honesty. For someone who has spent so long hiding behind wall, the very act of communication requires courage. They're opening a small door to their internal world, inviting the other person to witness a part of themselves that's usually shielded. And while the reach may not always be perfect, messy, or immediately reciprocal, it is a clear indicator that the avoidant is beginning to confront their own behavior and that anxiety has catalyzed a willingness to connect. In essence, the sudden reach is a manifestation of both regret and hope. It shows that the avoidant has recognized a misstep, that they feel the impact of their distance, and that they are motivated, at least in part, by the desire to correct it. The act is transformative because it marks a shift from purely self-preserving behavior to one that considers the needs and feelings of another person. In that moment, they are no longer just avoiding. They are acknowledging, engaging, and making an effort, however tentative, to rebuild the bridge they once burned or neglected. There is a subtle but powerful shift that happens when an avoidant begins to show vulnerability. For someone who has spent a lifetime guarding their emotions, keeping a tight lid on feelings, and projecting an air of independence, the moment they allow themselves to be seen in a raw human way is monumental. Avoidants often pride themselves on being in control, on appearing untouchable, on creating a sense of distance that shields them from discomfort. But when anxiety strikes, when the reality of what they may have lost hits them, something inside begins to crack, and vulnerability, which once seemed impossible, suddenly becomes their most human response. This vulnerability rarely appears overnight. It is often the product of intense internal conflict. Avoidants are not naturally inclined to openly express their emotions. In fact, they are wired to keep their feelings compartmentalized as a stray, eager to prevent hurt or rejection. But when they start to feel the weight of anxiety, the gnawing sense that a relationship or a connection is at risk, they are forced to confront emotions they usually suppress. In this moment, vulnerability is not a weakness, it is an act of courage. It is an acknowledgement that the fear of losing something valuable is greater than the fear of exposing their true self. When an avoidant begins to show vulnerability, it often starts subtly. They might share something small, a thought they've been pondering, a moment of insecurity, or a fleeting worry that they usually wouldn't voice. These small disclosures are critical. They are the first cracks in the emotional armor, the tiny openings through which they allow someone to glimpse the depth of their feelings. Even a short sentence, like admitting they've been thinking about the other person or confessing that they miss certain moments, carries enormous weight. It represents a conscious decision to move past the protective instincts that usually dominate their behavior. There's also a hesitation in their approach. Avoidants are careful. They gauge the reaction of the other person before diving deeper. They have spent years learning that being too open can leave them vulnerable, so their vulnerability is often tentative, measured, and cautious. Yet even in that caution, there is honesty. They are weighing their words, but they are also revealing themselves in ways they would never have considered during times of emotional comfort. This is the paradox of the anxious avoidant. The very fear that makes them pull away is the same fear that compels them to open up when the stakes are high. Anxiety, in essence, becomes the bridge that allows them to connect. When they truly show vulnerability, it is often accompanied by a level of reflection that is striking. Avoidants are typically introspective, even if they avoid sharing their insights. Anxiety forces them to face the consequences of their actions and to confront the emotional gaps they have created. In this reflective state, they may admit to mistakes, acknowledge times when they have hurt someone, or confess feelings of regret that have been simmering beneath the surface. This reflection is rarely forced or artificial. It emerges organically from the recognition that avoidance is no longer serving them and that honest communication may be the only way to repair a relationship. Another key element of vulnerability is emotional exposure. When avoidants express what they feel, whether it's sadness, fear, or longing, they risk being rejected or judged. This is particularly difficult for them because it challenges the narrative they have relied on for protection. For so long, distance has been their armor, but when that armor is dropped, even momentarily, it requires immense courage. It is important to understand that vulnerability from an avoidant is not always dramatic or overt. It can be quiet, subtle, or even indirect. A sigh, a pause, a hesitant, I'm not sure how to say this, can communicate volumes about the emotional shift occurring within them. The timing of this vulnerability is also significant. It usually surfaces at moments when anxiety peaks, when the fear of loss or the recognition of a mistake is unavoidable. This is not random, it is highly situational. Avoidants are not constantly vulnerable. They are vulnerable when circumstances push them to the edge of their comfort zone, when the potential for emotional connection outweighs the instinct to retreat. It is in these moments that they demonstrate their humanity most clearly, allowing the other person to see beyond the walls they have spent years constructing. It's also important to note that this vulnerability can be transformative for the relationship itself. When an avoidant opens up, it creates space for authentic connection. It signals a willingness to engage, to be accountable, and to allow emotions to be shared rather than hidden. Even if imperfectly executed, these moments of vulnerability break through patterns of detachment and avoidance, making way for empathy, understanding, and the possibility of real intimacy. The act of sharing their fears, regrets, or emotions communicates to the other person that they matter enough to overcome their own discomfort. Furthermore, vulnerability from an avoidant often carries a sense of urgency. Anxiety makes them acutely aware of the potential loss or distance they have created. This urgency fuels their willingness to take emotional risks. They may apologize, clarify misunderstandings, or express sentiments they have previously held back. While these expressions may seem hesitant or inconsistent, they are deliberate attempts to communicate care and concern. The anxiety acts as a catalyst, pushing them to bridge the gap between self-protection and emotional transparency. Ultimately, when an avoidant shows vulnerability, it is a rare and meaningful glimpse into their inner world. It reveals that beneath the surface of independence and detachment, there is a capacity for connection, empathy, and emotional honesty. It demonstrates that their distance is not a reflection of apathy, but a learned strategy to manage fear. And when they allow themselves to step into vulnerability, they show that they are capable of growth, reflection, and the courage to confront the very feelings they have worked so hard to hide. When an avoidant begins to make efforts to repair, it's one of the clearest signals that anxiety has pushed them beyond their usual patterns. Avoidants are typically known for their self-protective behaviors, their tendency to withdraw, and their preference for distance over confrontation. They have learned, often unconsciously, that pulling back shields them from discomfort, that independence equals safety, and that emotional intensity can feel threatening. But when the realization hits that their withdrawal has caused a rift or threatened a relationship, something inside shifts. They no longer simply retreat. Instead, they start to take steps, sometimes small, sometimes awkward, to repair the damage they sense they have done. These actions are not always perfect, but they are intentional, and they are loaded with significance. Repair for an avoidant is not merely about saying sorry. It goes far deeper than a casual gesture. It is an acknowledgement that their previous behavior has had consequences and that they are willing, however cautiously, to step into discomfort in order to mend what has been broken. The first steps toward repair can be subtle. They might reach out more consistently than they have before, check in at unexpected times, or revisit conversations they previously avoided. These are small but deliberate attempts to show that they are aware of the impact of their actions and that they value the relationship enough to try to make amends. The effort to repair is often tangible, in actions rather than words alone. Avoidants, when motivated by anxiety and the recognition of their mistakes, may engage in gestures that demonstrate attentiveness. They remember details about conversations or preferences they previously overlooked, make plans to spend time together, or follow through on commitments they might have neglected. These actions are not just performative, they are conscious attempts to rebuild trust and to show that their investment in the relationship is real. In many ways, their actions speak louder than anything they could verbalize, because for someone who naturally resists emotional exposure, doing is often more meaningful than saying. Another hallmark of this repair is consistency. Initially, their efforts might be tentative, appearing in bursts or at irregular intervals. But as they continue to confront the anxiety that has driven them to reach out, their efforts become more deliberate. They begin to anticipate the needs of the other person, show attentiveness without prompting, and demonstrate a willingness to engage on a level that might have been uncomfortable for them before. This growing consistency is a sign that they are not merely reacting to guilt or fear, but that they are actively trying to shift their patterns, however incrementally, toward connection rather than avoidance. Repair is also deeply linked to accountability. Avoidants who make efforts to repair are often reflecting on what went wrong and how their behavior contributed to tension or distance. They may offer apologies, acknowledge the impact of their actions, and express regret in ways that feel genuine rather than performative. This accountability is significant because it signals a break from the typical defense mechanisms of avoidance. Instead of deflecting, rationalizing, or minimizing their behavior, they confront it head on. They may stumble or phrase things awkwardly, but the intent is clear. They are trying to take responsibility and restore what has been damaged. Interestingly, the repair process often involves both emotional and practical dimensions. Emotionally, they may attempt to reconnect through vulnerable conversations, expressing feelings they might have previously kept hidden. Practically, they may follow through with tangible gestures, showing up, helping, or making an effort to meet the other person's needs. The combination of emotional honesty and practical action creates a bridge back to connection. It shows that the avoidant is not just experiencing remorse but is actively translating that remorse into behaviors that repair the relational gap. The timing of these efforts is also telling. Avoidants often act when anxiety has reached a threshold, a point where the discomfort of losing someone or the fear of permanent distance outweighs the comfort of detachment. It is anxiety that catalyzes the repair, pushing them to engage in ways they might otherwise avoid. This makes their efforts deeply intentional because they are taking steps despite the discomfort it may cause. Every act, every gesture, every message is a decision to step into vulnerability and take responsibility, which is significant for someone whose instinct is usually to retreat. Repair is rarely a single act, it is often a process. Avoidants may stumble, withdraw temporarily, or struggle to maintain consistency, but the key is that they keep returning to the effort. They may test boundaries, seek reassurance, or engage in repeated attempts to demonstrate care. Each attempt, however imperfect, represents an internal shift, a recognition that emotional connection is worth more than the safety of distance. The repetition is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign that the anxiety they feel has motivated them to prioritize connection over avoidance. It is also important to note that these repair efforts often reveal deeper layers of their personality. They show that beneath the surface of independence and detachment, there exists a capacity for empathy, reflection, and commitment. The gestures, the actions, the attentiveness, these are all proof that avoidance does not equal apathy. Instead, it highlights that they have a protective mechanism that can be softened when they truly recognize the value of the relationship. Repairing is a way of demonstrating that despite their fears, they care enough to take action, to bridge the emotional distance, and to try again. Even when it feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Finally, repair is a form of hope. Hope that the connection can be restored, that trust can be rebuilt, and that patterns of avoidance can be interrupted. Each effort, no matter how small, is a step towards showing that they are willing to confront their own limitations and make meaningful change. It is a sign of growth, of awareness, and of a willingness to engage in the very thing that avoidance often prevents: genuine, emotionally invested connection. When an avoidant begins to seek reassurance, it's a profound indicator of the internal tension they are experiencing. Typically, avoidants are known for their independence, their tendency to withdraw when things get emotionally intense, and their fear of relying on others. They spent years learning that self-sufficiency protects them from vulnerability, that emotional expression can feel risky, and that detachment is safer than connection. But when anxiety strikes, when they sense that they may have jeopardized a relationship or pushed someone away, they often shift in a way that is almost paradoxical. For someone who usually keeps distance as a protective measure, seeking reassurance represents a monumental step toward connection, and it signals that the fear of loss has begun to outweigh the comfort of detachment. Reassurance is rarely random or superficial. It is a deliberate act, often subtle, through which the avoidant attempts to measure the safety of the relationship. They might ask questions about feelings, subtly or directly, or look for signs that their presence, words, or actions are still valued. It can come in the form of simple check-ins, like asking, "Are we okay?" or "How do you feel about us?" Questions that may seem casual on the surface but are loaded with emotional significance. These moments reveal the avoidant's desire to gauge whether the emotional connection is intact and whether their attempts to re-engage are being received positively. Seeking reassurance is, at its core, an effort to manage anxiety and uncertainty, but it also represents a willingness to show vulnerability in a way that is not typical for them. The need for reassurance often emerges after a period of reflection or internal conflict. Avoidants usually need time to process their feelings before they are able to express them. During this processing period, they may become acutely aware of the gaps or mistakes in their behavior, moments when they withdrew too abruptly, failed to communicate effectively, or neglected emotional signals from the other person. This awareness creates a sense of unease that compels them to reach out. When they do, seeking reassurance becomes a way to bridge the gap between their internal anxiety and the external reality of the relationship. It allows them to test whether it is safe to continue moving toward connection or whether further withdrawal might be necessary. Seeking reassurance is also a reflection of self-awareness. Avoidants may not always articulate it in words, but internally, they are navigating a complex mix of fear, regret, and desire. They recognize that their distance or avoidance may have caused harm or created doubt, and in doing so, they begin to take steps to repair that uncertainty. The act of asking for reassurance, whether it's about the state of the relationship, the other person's feelings, or even their own behavior, is a tangible manifestation of this internal reckoning. It demonstrates that the avoidant is capable of reflecting on the consequences of their actions and is motivated to seek clarity rather than continue in ambiguity. The way avoidants seek reassurance is often nuanced. It can be verbal through direct questions or confessions, or nonverbal through actions that imply the need for affirmation. They may seek signs of engagement, consistency, or attention, testing the waters to see if they are still valued and wanted. For someone who typically guards their emotions, this is a remarkable act of courage. It requires them to momentarily lower their defenses, admit uncertainty, and rely on another person's response to regulate their own emotional state. Seeking reassurance is not a signal of weakness. It is a strategy that balances their fear of closeness with the recognition that connection is meaningful and worth pursuing. Timing plays a critical role in how reassurance manifests. Avoidants often seek reassurance when anxiety reaches a tipping point, when the fear of losing the other person or the realization of a mistake becomes unavoidable. It is this internal pressure that drives them to reach out, to probe, and to test the relationship's stability. The intensity of their anxiety determines the urgency and frequency of reassurance-seeking behaviors. At first, it may appear tentative or sporadic, but as their concern grows, their need for clarity can become more pronounced. Each attempt to seek reassurance is a subtle acknowledgement that they care and that the potential loss has become emotionally significant enough to override the instinct to withdraw. The forms of reassurance they seek can also reveal their emotional priorities. Avoidants may focus on understanding the other person's feelings, on clarifying expectations, or on affirming that their presence is still valued. They may also seek reassurance indirectly through observation of behavior rather than direct questioning, looking for patterns that indicate continued commitment or affection. This indirect approach reflects the IR cautious nature. They want to confirm safety without exposing themselves too fully, yet the desire for connection remains unmistakable. Even in these careful, measured ways, the avoidant demonstrates a willingness to engage emotionally, to validate their fears and uncertainties through interaction rather than isolation. The act of seeking reassurance is transformative for both the avoidant and the relationship. It opens the door for communication, fosters understanding, and signals a break from habitual avoidance. By asking for clarity or validation, they invite dialogue, which is a necessary step toward building trust and emotional intimacy. Their efforts to seek reassurance also indicate that they are capable of change. They are not merely acting out of fear, but are consciously attempting to bridge the gap between self-protection and connection. It shows that the avoidant is willing to confront their own anxieties and take meaningful action to nurture the relationship, even when doing so is uncomfortable. Ultimately, when an avoidant seeks reassurance, it is a moment of profound emotional honesty. It demonstrates that they are willing to expose a part of themselves they usually keep hidden, to acknowledge uncertainty, and to take the risk of vulnerability. In these moments, they reveal that their distance was never a reflection of indifference, but rather a protective strategy that can be softened when they recognize the value of connection. Seeking reassurance is a quiet yet powerful act that communicates care, reflection, and the willingness to engage, even in the face of fear. It is through these acts that avoidants show the capacity for growth, connection, and the courage to confront the very emotions they have long sought to avoid. When an avoidant begins to slow down the distance, it represents a profound shift in behavior, one that is rarely accidental and deeply rooted in the awareness of what they might have lost. Avoidants are known for creating space between themselves and others, often withdrawing emotionally or physically as a means of self-protection. They have learned that detachment shields them from vulnerability and disappointment, and that independence is synonymous with safety. Yet when anxiety strikes and they recognize that their withdrawal has consequences, whether it's the risk of losing someone meaningful or the realization that their behavior has caused pain, they may start to intentionally slow down that instinct to pull away. This is not a random act. It is a deliberate, often internalized decision to navigate closeness in a more measured way. Slowing down the distance doesn't necessarily mean they become suddenly, overtly affectionate or entirely present. Rather, it is a subtle, conscious adjustment in their approach to connection. They may maintain some of the protective behaviors they are accustomed to, but they start to modulate the intensity, the abruptness, and the frequency of their withdrawals. For instance, they might check in more consistently, respond to messages instead of leaving them unanswered, or engage in conversations that they might previously have avoided. These small but meaningful adjustments are signs that the avoidant is beginning to balance their fear of intimacy with the recognition that pulling away entirely can be damaging. In essence, they are learning to tolerate closeness without letting it overwhelm them. This process is often prompted by anxiety, but it is coupled with a growing awareness of the other person's needs. Avoidants may realize that their habitual withdrawal is hurting someone they care about. That distance can create frustration, doubt, or even disconnection. In response, they start to slow down the pattern of detachment, taking more deliberate steps toward engagement. This might include anticipating the other person's needs, staying present in conversations, or making small, consistent efforts to be emotionally available. While it may not appear dramatic, this shift is significant because it signals that they are actively working against their instinct to flee, choosing instead to prioritize connection over self-preservation. Slowing down the distance is also a reflection of emotional courage. Avoidants have often built habits around avoiding discomfort, but in this context, they are intentionally stepping into situations that previously would have triggered withdrawal. They may still feel anxious, hesitant, or uncertain, but the act of slowing their retreat shows a willingness to face those feelings rather than allow them to dictate their behavior. Each measured step toward engagement, no matter how tentative, represents a conscious effort to maintain the connection, even in the face of internal resistance. It is a quiet but powerful signal that they are taking responsibility for their impact on the relationship. Consistency plays a critical role in this process. Initially, their attempts to slow the distance may be irregular, appearing in bursts or isolated moments of engagement. Over time, however, these efforts often become more stable as they begin to internalize the value of presence and emotional availability. They may start to anticipate potential points of tension and address them proactively, communicate more clearly, and remain attentive in ways that signal genuine effort. The move toward consistency is particularly significant because it demonstrates that the avoidant is not merely reacting to anxiety in a momentary way, but is actively seeking to integrate a healthier approach to connection into their behavior. Slowing down distance also involves learning to tolerate discomfort and uncertainty. Avoidants often withdraw because they are uncomfortable with intense emotion, conflict, or dependence. By intentionally modulating their distance, they are practicing the ability to remain present even when emotional intensity arises. They might allow themselves to stay in difficult conversations, offer support during challenging moments, or accept expressions of need without retreating. This ability to tolerate closeness without fleeing reflects a critical shift in their internal narrative. They are beginning to see that intimacy does not have to be threatening, that closeness can be navigated safely, and that emotional engagement can coexist with personal autonomy. Another key aspect of slowing down distance is the way it signals a commitment to repair and growth. Avoidance may have previously withdrawn as a form of self-protection, inadvertently creating emotional gaps. By intentionally moderating this withdrawal, they are actively contributing to rebuilding trust, demonstrating accountability, and showing that they are willing to engage in the give and take required for meaningful relationships. These steps, though often subtle, communicate care and investment in a way that words alone may not fully capture. It is through action, through the conscious decision to remain present, that avoidance can begin to demonstrate reliability and consistency in a relationship. This process is often gradual and iterative. Avoidants may experience moments of hesitation, relapse into old patterns, or struggle to fully regulate their instinct to pull back. However, each effort to slow the distance represents progress, even when imperfect. It is an ongoing learning experience, one in which they are navigating the tension between self-protection and connection. The key is that they are choosing to engage rather than retreat entirely, which reflects both self-awareness and emotional growth. Ultimately, when an avoidant slows down the distance, it is a sign of deep internal work. It shows that anxiety has served as a catalyst for self-reflection, that they are capable of recognizing the impact of their behavior, and that they are willing to take intentional steps to maintain connection. This slowing is not about eliminating boundaries or abandoning independence. It is about finding a balance between self-preservation and the desire for meaningful intimacy. In doing so, they demonstrate the capacity for transformation, emotional resilience, and the willingness to bridge the gap between fear and connection. Reflection is a powerful moment for an avoidant, though it is often one of the quietest and most internal processes they go through. Avoidants are typically known for their instinct to protect themselves through distance and detachment. They have learned that staying emotionally independent shields them from vulnerability, disappointment, and hurt. But when anxiety surfaces, when they sense the risk of losing someone important or realize that their actions have caused tension, they begin to engage in a level of introspection that is deeply revealing. Reflection allows them to examine their patterns, to recognize the impact of their behavior, and to confront the ways in which avoidance has shaped their relationships. It is in these moments of self-examination that the avoidant begins to understand not just the what of their behavior, but the why, which is critical for meaningful growth and change. Reflection is rarely immediate. It often comes after a period of emotional tension, distance, or conflict. Avoidants may initially respond to discomfort with their usual strategies, withdrawal, silence, or emotional detachment. But when the anxiety of potentially losing a valued connection grows strong enough, they are compelled to look inward. This internal scrutiny is not always easy. It forces them to face uncomfortable truths about themselves and their habitual responses. They may realize that avoidance, while protective, has also created gaps in their relationships, missed opportunities for connection, or unintended hurt. This awareness is the foundation of reflection. It marks the moment when self-protection begins to give way to self-awareness. The process of reflecting on patterns is often subtle, introspective, and deeply personal. Avoidants may replay interactions in their minds, analyze conversations, and question their own behavior. They might consider times when they pulled away too quickly, failed to communicate effectively, or let fear dictate their decisions. Each of these moments becomes a piece of a larger puzzle, helping them understand the recurring themes in their behavior. This reflection is not about assigning blame to others, rather, it is an honest examination of how their avoidance has influenced the dynamics of their relationships. It is an effort to understand themselves more clearly, and in doing so, to create the potential for healthier connection. A critical aspect of this reflection is emotional honesty. Avoidants are often masters at compartmentalizing feelings and avoiding the messy aspects of emotional life, but reflection forces them to confront these emotions head on. They may feel guilt, regret, or frustration with themselves for having created distance or misunderstandings. They may recognize patterns of fear or insecurity that have driven their behavior. This emotional honesty is essential because it allows them to move beyond reactive behavior and begin to act with intention. Without it, they risk repeating the same patterns indefinitely, but with it, they open the door to growth and transformation. Reflection also often leads to insight about the needs of others. Avoidance may begin to recognize how their behaviors have impacted those they care about, the feelings of uncertainty, disappointment, or hurt that may have arisen from their withdrawal. This understanding is significant because it shifts their perspective from self-protection to relational awareness. It allows them to consider not just their own comfort, but the emotional realities of the people they are close to. This shift in perspective is what enables them to begin making meaningful adjustments in how they interact, communicate, and respond in relationships. The act of reflection is rarely a one-time event, it is an ongoing process. Avoidants may revisit patterns repeatedly, especially when new situations or conflicts arise. Each reflection reinforces their understanding of their behaviors, triggers, and emotional responses. Over time, this repetition helps them develop greater emotional intelligence and self-regulation. They begin to notice early signs of their own avoidance, allowing them to pause and choose a different response before falling back into old habits. This iterative nature of reflection is what makes it so transformative. It is not about instant change, but about cultivating awareness that leads to incremental growth. Reflection is often accompanied by a desire to change. As avoidants examine their patterns, they may identify specific behaviors they want to modify, such as withdrawing too quickly, avoiding difficult conversations, or suppressing emotional expression. They may also develop strategies to communicate more effectively, remain present during conflict, or manage their fears of closeness in healthier ways. This intentionality is what differentiates reflection from mere rumination. It is not about obsessing over mistakes. It is about learning from them and using insight to guide future behavior. Reflection becomes a tool for conscious decision-making rather than a source of paralysis or shame. An important dimension of this reflection is humility. Avoidants may come to recognize that their strategies of detachment, while protective, have limitations. They may see that avoidance has prevented them from fully experiencing connection, intimacy, and emotional fulfillment. This humility can be transformative because it allows them to acknowledge that they are not invulnerable, that their emotions are valid, and that relationships require effort, presence, and engagement. By accepting these truths, they create the internal space to approach relationships differently, more mindfully, more openly, and with a greater capacity for connection. Reflection also encourages accountability. Avoidants begin to see patterns not as fixed traits, but as behaviors they can influence and adjust. They recognize that their avoidance has consequences, and this awareness motivates them to act differently. They may seek to apologize, explain, or repair dynamics that have been affected by their past behavior. This accountability is essential for building trust and demonstrating to others that they are capable of growth. It signals that avoidance is not a permanent barrier, but a habit that can be understood, addressed, and ultimately transformed. Ultimately, reflection is where change begins. It is the quiet, internal work that prepares the avoidant to engage with their relationships in a more conscious, intentional, and emotionally intelligent way. By examining their patterns, understanding their triggers, and acknowledging their impact on others, they lay the foundation for healthier connection. Reflection allows them to move from automatic avoidance to mindful engagement, from fear-driven withdrawal to intentional presence, and from self-protection to relational growth. It is through this process that the avoidant begins to bridge the gap between who they have been and who they are capable of becoming in relationships. As we've explored today, the moments when an avoidant realizes their mistake are not just fleeting instances. They are profound opportunities for growth, connection, and transformation, whether it's reaching out unexpectedly, showing vulnerability, making efforts to repair, seeking reassurance, slowing down the distance, or reflecting on their patterns. Each action is a window into the humanity that lies beneath the walls they've built. These behaviors reveal a person who is learning, evolving, and willing to confront their fears for the sake of meaningful connection. What we can take away from this is not only a better understanding of avoidant tendencies, but also a reminder that growth is always possible. Everyone has patterns, fears, and defenses, but awareness and intentional action can turn even the most deeply ingrained habits into opportunities for love, trust, and deeper connection. By noticing these moments, responding with patience and empathy, and valuing the effort behind the actions, we create the space for real, lasting intimacy to flourish. Thank you all for listening and taking the time to engage with this important topic. Your attention and openness are what make discussions like this meaningful. I hope today's insights inspire you to recognize the subtle signals of growth in yourself and others, to embrace vulnerability, and to appreciate the courage it takes to bridge the gap between fear and connection. Thank you once again from the bottom of my heart for your time, your curiosity, and your willingness to explore the complexities of human relationships with me. It has been a privilege to share these ideas with you today, and I hope you leave with not only knowledge, but also inspiration to approach connection with greater awareness and empathy.